Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Austin Picard. Last name is spelled Picard. And he came to my attention because I was on a show with Jose Gallison, so I kind of follow him on social media X. And he said, hey, there's a guy with a podcast. And I looked through the kind of catalog, and a lot of stuff I'm very much interested in. So it's kind of like a similar thing. But I came across one of the podcast titles about the Solar Temple. And it was always something that I was interested in. And not a lot of Americans have heard about it because it largely took place in the French-speaking world. But exactly. I had known about it because I was on the show. A lot of people don't know this. But back in 2015, I was on a show called Occult Crimes. And it was produced by a guy named Christian Page in English. His name in French would be Christian Page or something like that. But I was in Hollywood and taped a lot of video, and I made it onto that show. And it played on Netflix for a minute, not very long, but it's still around. I have an IMDb quote on that, but you can watch it, I think, on Amazon Prime or somewhere. It's really good. I really recommend it, too, because it is from kind of that French perspective, or, Francais. And this is an interesting story because the reason I kind of came to my attention, and it's a very ornate story, the story of the Solar Temple. There's a lot of moving parts. It's very strange, too, because it's international component, but also Crowley was involved. So back at that time, when I was kind of researching a lot of Crowley, much more so than today, that this whole topic or the story of the Solar Temple came to my attention. So that's what we're going to talk about. And Austin Picard operates. The title of his podcast is the Underclass Podcast. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. People can check that out and find some of his past research. But Austin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, William. It means the world to me that you're having me on, honestly, because like I just mentioned briefly in private, like I'm very much a fan of your work. And I, just as you mentioned, my line of interest kind of tends to overlap extremely often with the things that you tend to cover and the guests that you tend to have on. And so for me, like, for an example, just recently, my most recent solo project was about Steve Smith and the psychopath machine. And then we were just discussing how basically Jonestown, I consider to be sort of this consequence of MK Ultra being driven underground, potentially after post being exposed publicly through the church committee hearings. It seems to be the case that, one, they were already sort of propping up this, at least the intelligence apparatus seemingly was propping up this sort of international private intelligence network that would no longer be held accountable by any sort of government accountability, that they could sort of, achieve plausible deniability in many ways, and also be able to have different cover organizations that provide that exact thing, plausible deniability. And so to me, when you have things like the Order of the Solar Temple, which like you mentioned, it went largely kind of unnoticed in the United States, I kind of have my suspicions that it had a lot to do with Waco, Ruby Ridge, OKC at the time, kind of dominating the news cycle, right? And PatCon was really at play during that time. And so, because when all of the deaths occurred with the OTS, which, spoiler alert, sorry, I will introduce the actual organization, but it was in 94, and it happened over the course of 3 years, right? So there was 3 separate incidents, and all in different areas of the world as well, and largely in French-speaking Quebec. You have in Canada, then you also have in Switzerland, in Sherry, Switzerland, right? And also in France. So it's kind of like you had mentioned, it's this international effect that this organization had. I mean, they were even attempting to branch out into Australia and the Canary Islands, I think, even. And
Martinique.
Yeah, it reminded me of the Process Church in many ways, especially with sort of the structure of the hierarchy and how it was sort of built was it was very much a pay to play system, right? Where they weren't just recruiting just anyone. And this, to me, this sort of group functioned much more as a secret society than a cult group, right? Like, I think that there's at least some sort of distinction that should be made there, because to me, it seems to be like the OTS was an offshoot of the Rosicrucian Order and the Knights Templars and all these other, foundational pillars of secret societies that tend to, when anytime you probe into any of these, let's say, the Tool Society, this sort of used in the Weimar Republic and post World War I to kind of infiltrate operators within the Nazi Party, which then paved the way for when the assassination of Kurt Eisner in 1919. It sort of paved the way for the uprising of the Nazi Party. And that was all seeded by the Tool Society, which was also an offshoot and a branch of the Rosicrucian Knights Templars. And it was created in Turkey, basically, by this German intelligence asset. And
Sabotendorf,
who inevitably sort of disappears at the end of the war.
Maybe suspicious death too. Died in the Bosphorus, like exactly. Where he came from. Like, you can't even write this stuff.
He's
insanity. A much interesting character, overlooked, but
very much so. And also you have, like, I had mentioned William Holsinger, right? Because I think that what he kind of has to offer, as far as he was the aide to Congressman Leo Ryan, who died in Jonestown. And I kind of think that I have a suspicion that he was lured down to Jonestown to take out a thorn in the side of the CIA at the time, who was investigating MKUltra, probing MKUltra facilities.
He was like the church. He was kind of like the church of 78.
It was insanity.
Kind of that time,
yeah. So. And he was a very radical congressman. Like, could you imagine that happening today? I can't even picture that. But
no, an actual muckraker who would go in and investigate things hand on,
right?
Because he would do that in cities if there was problems with the corruption. He really took his job seriously and ended up dead. Like, he was
exactly
really figured out.
I know, and so William Holsinger, he had a quote that I will never forget, and I mentioned this on, I believe, episode 1 I did with Jose when we did a series covering the Finders cult, right? And because I think it's sort of applies in many ways because of how many connections to intelligence Marion Petty and the Finders organization have. It's kind of shocking, but really not surprising at this point. But nonetheless, William Holsinger, he claims that he feared that the CIA might have been running a covert operation at Jonestown so sinister it would shock even hardened CIA watchdogs. And in 1980, Holsinger, who had already discovered Richard Dwyer's presence at Jonestown, right, who I believe to be a CIA operator, an asset who was really handling Jim Jones, I would say.
I think it's confirmed. I think Dwyer's confirmed CIA asset.
Oh, yes.
Not like a CIA contractor, like a lot of people say, but like a member of the CIA.
And he was even at Port Cayuma airstrip when the deaths occurred, and then went right back to the pavilion in Jonestown in the People's Temple Agricultural Project when the death tape happened, or at least was recorded, and you hear Jim saying, "Get Dwyer out of here," right? It's take Dwyer on down to the big house or something. It's so crazy,
It's unbelievable.
It really is, especially when you hear just listening to the death tape it's so disturbing and eerie and strange. It's strange. Clearly there were psychoactive mind control experiments happening at the People's Temple. But anyway,
and it overlaps with this story. It's basically like a cult. There's drugs. There's suspicions on how people died at Jonestown. The whole story was stated that Jonestown death site was staged. It's obviously staged, and there were doctors there who said
Dr.
these
Leslie
people had,
Mutu.
yeah, they had syringes. There's no question about it. So
They had
the
syringe
whole,
marks in their back.
just let me finish the sentence. Hold on.
I'm sorry,
So
William.
the thing is that the cover story is they all got this Kool-Aid juice or whatever it was called, Everclear or whatever. But that's just really just a superficial analysis of what really happened. So like people got bad information. There's still bad information out there today. So that's another thing, like why a big question. So this solar temple happened in 84, Jonestown 78, Heaven's Gate 97. These are all very similar in a lot of ways. But for people who haven't heard the story of the solar temple, maybe it's best just to go over a topical because it's a lot of detail. I mean, this pops up BCCI, arms smuggling, sexual abuse, sexual magic. I mean, it's all here, really, when you really start parsing through the layers. It's really incredible. But for people who don't know what the solar temple was or is, we kind of went through the background. It didn't come out of a vacuum, right? The OTO's around, the Order of Oriental Templars is around, same kind of thing, same kind of vibe. But maybe you can go into the solar temple and who the two main characters were.
Definitely. So it's really been described as a Neo-Templar movement because it was kind of out of the Jacques Breyer, sort of a lot of disciples of Jacques Breyer, as far as this Neo-Templar resurgence was in the mindset and of a lot of these different groups at the time, that were so many different groups were materializing over time, but they had all these different influences from like philosophies of the Rosicrucianism, Rosicrucian order, let's say Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and Aleister Crowley and the OTO, as you mentioned. And so but what I find strange is that it seems to have been more of a Masonic initiatory society is how a lot of people view it. And that makes a lot of sense to me because it does. When you see how many different organizations that Joseph de Mambro, who was one of the founders of the OTS, along with Luc Jouret, you see how many organizations they belonged to prior to this, as well as even being a grand master of a prior organization that then, after Julian Orrigas, who we'll get to later, because there is inevitably Operation Gladio tie-in to all of this, and overlapping threads with the Marc Dutroux networks and the neo-Nazi paramilitary groups that were all within Belgian Gladio, and really destabilizing the nation in many ways, committing terrorist attacks, domestic terrorism. It's fascinating when you look into it. The West Brabant Post, I believe, is one of the names of one of the radical extremist organizations that were committing some of these bombings and things of that nature. And they would just bomb grocery stores, right? And very crazy, commit assassinations. But primarily, they were very much inspired by occultism. And I think that should be a primary focus for us, because once you realize the different rituals that they were engaging in and things of that nature, especially there's even pentagrams in the rooms, and they have secret rooms as well, which I find absolutely insane when the authorities were attempting to discover some of the bodies.
It's unbelievable, like how ornate this whole organization was. BCCI, money laundering, arms trafficking, just off the charts. But these two guys, de Mambro was a very experienced time up until the time he died. He was a very experienced occultist and scam artist. So he was kind of like maybe all kind of cult leaders are a bit of a hustler scam artist, like Jim Jones or Marshall Applewhite. Maybe you can talk about de Mambro and his history. Definitely.
He actually went to jail for swindling and being a con man and even behaving as a psychiatrist when he actually was not. And so he was posing as a psychiatrist and also was charged for that at a certain time. But I find it insane when you realize that, I guess, kind of the power dynamics of the hierarchy, like you're alluding to with DeMembro and Jaurès. It's interesting because DeMembro was kind of considered to be the true head of the organization, right? Well, some former members have described Jaurès as, what they kind of say is that he's more of like this charismatic figurehead that really was much more successful in the recruiting aspect of wealthy converts, and also getting people to buy in more to the OTS doctrine, right? Which is very interesting as well, because it really is like, there's even one point where, because there's this prophecy of a future solar god king that is embedded within their doctrine, and that comes to fruition with one of Joseph DeMembro's, what they have this strategy called cosmic coupling, and they would just break up marriages of individuals who were within the group, and then they would reassign them to other individuals within the group. And it was, what they were claiming is that through these rituals that they would conduct, they would give individuals, like, let's say, something to drink that had some sort of psychoactive substance in it before the ritual would take place, where they would then witness what they called ascended masters would descend and meet with them in this ritual, and they would call upon them and they would descend. And then essentially it was just absolutely absurd when you realize that they actually were using holographic special effects to convince many of the members of the group that this was actually occurring, that they were really meeting with these descended masters from the planet Sirius, which is really, which all plays into the Neo-Templar order and many of their belief systems. And even in esoteric Hitlerism, if you read into any of that, and Miguel Serrano and things of that nature, and you hear what they believe in, like Colonia Dignidad, right, was and sort of what the Nazis believed at Mount Shasta, and all of these different insane occult prophecies that they were attempting to really fulfill. And it's extraordinary when you get into it all. But anyway, so
Sirius is Masonic as well. It's occultism, but it's the North Star, or blazing star, or something like that. So very important. So you see all these occults, all the same kind of concepts bleed over. Alice Bailey and Blavatsky's all over this, and the races and white supremacy. So it has a little bit of that kind of vibe to it, this kind of white supremacy. It really does. Vibe, yeah. And so, of course, Joseph DeMembro, the French cult leader, is a convicted con man, right? Considered to be the true head of the organization. And so born in France in August of 1924, the oldest of three siblings, DeMembro would joyously recall a time when his sister was decapitated after she stuck her head out of a train window. And this is according to the 1997 book published in French called The Order of the Solar Temple. And investigation and revelations on the nights of the apocalypse is, so from the age of 16 on, this is what Joseph DeMembro was up to. He first gained an apprenticeship as a jeweler and watchmaker. He then proceeded to open a jewelry store where he fixed watches and surrounded himself with luxury goods, which he was noted to be strangely obsessed with his outward appearance. And so after the war, his business began to suffer, and DeMembro oddly decided to transition into making a living as a medium. And so by the 1950s, DeMembro became involved in all these various esoteric groups, and he became affiliated with the ancient and mystical order Rosicrucis, Amorc, also known as the Rosicrucian Order, one of the most active groups at that time, I know. And attending the Amorc meeting in 1955 is the first time that it's officially recorded that Joseph DeMembro attended. And so at this point,
DeMambro seemingly becomes convinced that he was this great spirit. This is the lore behind Joseph DeMambro from the ancient past. And according to a report in the Oxford University Press, DeMambro variously claimed to be a reincarnation of Osiris, Akhenaten, Moses, and the Italian occultist Cagliostro. So this all plays a major role within the OTS doctrine, because they would reveal, Luc Jouret and Joseph DeMambro would reveal to members of the group who they were as far as some prominent reincarnation. And it would be just, of course, it would never be some lowly peasant. It's always some noticeable historical figure that they would, of course, be the reincarnation of. And so,
yeah, one of them was, for example, they found this very rich guy whose name I can't remember right now, but they said, "You're Joseph of Arimathea," and then they took all his money. So they had millions of dollars. This was not a poor organization. People would donate whole houses and everything, almost like Scientology, like literal Church of Greed type stuff.
The heck?
This is if you're watching this on Rockfin or Rumble or X, this is a picture of DeMambro, kind of what he looked like, and his wife. He had a wife, and his daughter was privileged, and all this stuff. You're muted, by the way. And then let's see. Your mic actually became unconnected for some reason. And then this is another picture I saw. This is just kind of the flowery stuff that they had in their rituals. There was some videos of rituals out there, which they're all in white capes. They have the Maltese cross, I guess it's called, or something like that. It says on my side that your mic is not connected. Background of cosmic music. The followers recite texts on water, and there's other things that they said. I was reading through one of their articles. It was really something else, but just some of the quotes. This is from a book that was translated into English. One of the quotes is, "Neither the races nor human evolution are the fruit of chance. They are ruled by an occult brotherhood made up of 33 masters," right? The famous 33 number. "The elder brothers of the Rose Cross, or the Rose Quarry, as well as a few adepts gathered in small and discreet brotherhoods. Until today, they have maintained a proper balance between the light and the darkness, which is what the alchemists called solve a coagula," right? So they have solve a coagula. So a lot of that other stuff. You're back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry about that.
Okay. It's no big deal.
What happened?
I'm just reading. But it was super secretive. This organization really relied on secrecy like a lot of other stuff.
Absolutely. No, it definitely did. And I would say, just briefly, I think it's kind of a really important story that I was completely unaware of until I did my OTS episode and kind of took the plunge and went down the rabbit hole. But basically, I grew up watching classic movies and classic films. Like, I was a big Hitchcock fan for sure. And so I saw Grace Kelly many times, right, over the years. And I did not realize there was a direct connection to the Order of the Solar Temple with the death of Grace Kelly potentially. And the Scotsman published an article in 2010 that was covering all of this, and even said that it's absolutely insane, because they are describing from the perspective of this acupuncturist, right, who would engage in the ritual ceremonies, which were, of course, many of the different ceremonies had to do with sex magic and involved sex magic in the ritual. And so this acupuncturist, who was apparently employed during these sex magic rituals to, I guess, enable the physical pressure points in different areas of the body and so Grace Kelly was actually involved in one of these. And it's described as security lookouts lined the route, their walkie-talkies crackling into life as soon as each checkpoint was passed. This was not the first car to make the 4-hour journey from the Principality of Monaco to the remote French village of Villy-Morgon that day, but the beautiful female occupant was by far the most important. Her arrival had been planned in detail, and no expense had been spared. The cascades of white flowers that decorated the priory were for her benefit alone, which, by the way, their meeting place for many of the rituals they called the pyramid, which, again, it's playing into all of these different overlapping threads within these various doctrines. And so to its head of security, they had seemed an innocuous detail, but one he knew he must get right if he wanted to stay in favor with his boss, Joseph de Membro. I believe the security, they had armed security at their rituals as well, and their different various ceremonies. And one of these security guards was willing to talk after all of this occurred. And so, but he wanted to remain anonymous as well, because many of them do seem like they're very terrified to go on the record speaking about this organization if they actually survived, from 94 to 97. But thankfully, he and this acupuncturist were willing to speak on the record. And so as de Membro's most trusted employee, he was familiar with the need for subterfuge when it came to deceiving the rich men and women who engaged in ritualistic practices at the priory. Even he, however, was dumbfounded when the car pulled up and its blonde passenger disembarked. The woman before him was Princess Grace of Monaco, Grace Kelly, and soon she would undergo a sexually charged initiation into the murderous cult of the Solar Temple. So, first, the princess was taken to a derobing chamber where an acupuncturist, who to this day is still haunted by the princess's intense blue eyes, allegedly, began to relax her by placing needles on meridians known to give sexual pleasure. And then Grace was given something to drink, perhaps a tranquilizer. And I heard, I heard a survivor that was essentially Terry Huguenin, I think was his name. He was the one they attempted to lure to become basically 53 deaths occurred in Schiri, Switzerland in 94. And that was the first round of deaths, but it was supposed to be 54. And it was sort of this symbolic implication that was leaning into the original Knights Templars and the fourth Frederick, King of France, that burned these Templars at the stake. There were 54 martyrs. And so it was like the symbolic reference to the 54 Knights Templars that were burned at the stake. But anyway, it gets absolutely insane when you look into most of this. But what I find most interesting about the Grace Kelly connection is just that she was, on the day that she was, well, at least she died in the car accident. She had allegedly she had all her luggage in her car. It looked like she was attempting to escape something. And what I find most interesting is that, according to this account, de Membro was trying to leverage more money out of her than she was really willing to give to him. And so a dispute happened, and she pretty much threatened him that she was willing to expose the Order of the Solar Temple for what they really were. And then within very short amount of time, she dies in this car accident. And when you realize that the Prince of Monaco at the time, which she was married to, was actually one of the key sponsors of the OTS at the time in Monaco and the OTS chapter in Monaco, then it kind of starts to paint a more legitimate and credible picture as far as like potential motivation for her death, more being a murder than an accidental car accident or crash. And so, yes, I think, at least to me, I'm very skeptical of that official narrative, but
you should be. It's pretty suspicious. Like, absolutely. One of the most famous people of all time, like, drives off a cliff right after she's involved in a cult where they take $10 million. It's very convenient that a lot of these people died. These are convenient deaths, and there's a lot of suspicious deaths, not just at the end of the cult, But during their time, they infiltrated like the energy
Hydro-cooled.
Yeah. And like was tinkering around with it, like, or running scams. So it was just like almost like they understood infiltration and all kinds of different things and kept secret. So like the process church analogy is apt. There's no question about it. Like all kinds of
Absolutely.
crazy stuff.
Yeah, and you had and I find the parallels to Jonestown again from the concerned relatives and that were really involved in kind of bringing the authorities' attention and spotlighting what was about to occur and what did happen to occur. And then, of course, questioning the narrative of voluntary mass suicide, because you see, most of the victims they had bags over their head and suffocated and had multiple gunshot wounds to the head. And it was very clear that it wasn't a suicide in many of the cases. But around 1966, there's a strange thing that happens with DeMambro that I think is very interesting, because this is right after he successfully swindles and defrauds the co-owner of his jewelry store before he founds the OTS. And he basically vanishes with all of the company's valuable assets and moves his family to Tel Aviv, claiming that his child being born in Israel would grant it an exceptional destiny. I found that very suspicious because, again, what Steve Smith was saying about the manufactured mercenaries and things of that nature at Oak Ridge, and like how they were winding up at a kibbutz in Israel, and then how many times does this come up when like, let's say, Andreas Strassmeyer's the same exact scenario, right? His father's involved with Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, who staged his own assassination at one point as a presidential candidate, and so it's kind of ridiculous when you see how often these individuals who look to be involved in intelligence wind up at a kibbutz in Israel or on the front lines with the IDF, and it makes or are being trained in combat by the IDF. It's very strange. But so he later claims to members of the OTS, DeMambro, that the reason he had been in Israel was that he had been asked by the chief rabbi to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem for pay, claiming that he refused payment as he was not interested in money. So DeMambro then moves back to France in 1972, and this is when he's sentenced to 6 months in prison for breaching patient trust while impersonating a psychiatrist. And an
important point here about DeMambro is he was a skilled hypnotist as well.
Absolutely.
So that's an important component. So he's putting the zap on his followers probably one way or another.
That makes a lot of sense. And especially considering the different psychoactive drugs that we're utilizing before the various ceremonies and things, it's always going to make, as far as it really seems like a list of MK Ultra drugs, like the same as in Jonestown. It's very much manipulating and psychological control, and it's 100% in the vein of the dissociative identity disorder that's involved in a lot of these networks like Dutroux that I mentioned, where they are skilled hypnotists and they implement DID, which creates all these alternate personalities, and you have this alternate personality disorder, and it's a very sad thing if you read through the X dossier, and it's tragic, honestly, and what happened to those victims in Belgium. But anyway, after he served,
it is just a sec. One thing that is interesting is around this time also, who's tinkering around with the Amorc is Sirhan, right? 67, 68. So it's pretty incredible. Yeah.
Especially when Sirhan has affiliation with the process as well, which I found very insane, that he had a friend who worked at the Ambassador Hotel who allegedly worked in the kitchen that he had met prior to, and they said within 24 hours of him showing up and being basically hypno-programmed, it seems. And what Lisa Peace believes is that he was firing blanks in the pantry that night at RFK, while I believe it to be Thane Eugene Cesar was the security guard moonlighting as a security guard, which was really the one who took the shots and fired the shots into RFK from point blank range right behind him, and that's why he fell on top of him, and Thane Eugene Cesar got rid of the weapon very soon after as well. It's I think he has connections to Howard Hughes and a lot of the intelligence networks that were going on at the time.
Robert Mayhew is a real operator. So
exactly, Robert Mayhew is even, I believe, involved with really the Mullen and Company's cover contract operation with the CIA and their involvement in the Watergate break-in.
It goes on and on. These guys all know each other.
Absurd. But Luc Jouret, of course, the co-founder, he was born in 1947, and he was born in the Belgian Congo. And I think he really provides the most direct connection to what I see as Operation Gladio, because of his connections to Julian Rodriguez and these insane, radical, neo-Nazi paramilitary organizations and groups that were, like I said, destabilizing governments, staging domestic coups d'etats, just doing it was all in the name of combating communism at the time. But so was Operation 40, and you know, that doesn't justify anything ethically or morally in my mind as far as what was taking place. And but his Belgian parents would then return home in the 50s, and Jouret attended the Free University of Brussels, from which he received his medical degree. So he had gained like significant credibility. You know, he was giving speeches about homeopathic medicine and all this different. It's strange though, because once he's in college, he's allegedly a Marxist, right? And is even placed under police surveillance apparently. But then he joins in 1976, like 2 years after he graduates, he joins the Belgian army and becomes a paratrooper, right? And that raised some red flags to me a little bit, especially considering who he became involved with as a paratrooper, because that seems to be where all the connections to the intelligence and private intelligence organizations come from. But so following his time in the army, he begins a formal study of homeopathy and emerged as this homeopathic physician who's giving speeches all over the place. And that included Hydro-Quebec, which is how he got like people within the leadership at Hydro-Quebec who were very high up in the company. Actually, one of them allegedly helped commit some of the murders in Quebec of the 16 that died in Quebec there in Canada. And he was one of the last two who apparently committed the killings and then turned around to order the bodies in the symbolic shape, which seemed to be some sort of occult symbol, and then turn around and shoot themselves in the mouth to directly fall into position. That was the official narrative behind. And along with this official within Hydro-Quebec that allegedly did this was a Quebec police officer. So again, it's kind of significant, I would say, that all of the individuals involved in this group are well off. They seem to be, there are even mayors and heads of corporations, and also a lot of families inevitably were leaving the group up until the massive, what they called a transit to the star Sirius, which was the alleged mass suicide. It's very sad because it seems like they had given up a lot of their belongings and even just signed away their property to Joseph de Membro and Luc Jouret, and so they were suing the group leading up to the mass killings. And there were many different things that seemed to be overexposing the OTS at the time, and also bringing the authorities, into scope, as far as they were definitely aware of the OTS. And what is even more interesting is that there were all of these different official reports of the OTS being involved in running guns, which is inevitably what Luke Jure and 3 other members get busted for, leading up to the deaths as well, which was an illegal gun running operation. And it seems like they were also smuggling, money laundering was a huge part of it as well. And that's another part that I think we should be aware of as far as these cult organizations. They seem to provide a very useful strategy in terms of money laundering, gun running, crossing borders internationally. And like I would say the William Branham, model of using religion to cross international borders where otherwise, let's say, an intelligence organization wouldn't be permitted. And I find that to be a recurring tactic, right, in these circles.
Very much in the CIA, all kinds
Absolutely.
of Protestant, missionaries and stuff delivering information back. This is Luke Jure right here, I think, in one of these rituals. Yep. He seemed to be the better public face for this group than DeMambro. So
exactly. That was it. Yep, and DeMambro had been a Rosicrucian, like I said, and Jure had in 1981 affiliated with the Renewed Order of the Temple, an occult order founded in the 70s by Julian Orrigas, which is the direct tie-in to Belgian Gladio. And to me, Operation Gladio in general seems to be a much larger network in scope. And it was very much, I think, involved with the rat lines set up post-World War II, right, through paperclip rat lines. And I think a great example of that is Colonia Dignidad and all the different Nazi SS members who pretty much were stationed there at a time as far as a Nazi safe haven that was really given cover in Chile and facilitated.
Just one of many. They're all over the place in South America.
All over. And so DeMambro in 1982, this is when he announces this great mission, right? Because they soon discovered their mutual interests upon meeting at this Rosicrucian conference. It was called the Golden Way Foundation, is what it was called. And it was more like this umbrella organization for all these different Rosicrucian groups and Templar orders. And it seems like Jure was lecturing, all over the place. He was going to all these different holistic health and paranormal, association meetings and like the Amenta Club, he was even giving lectures at, which was later named the Atlanta Club, I believe. But among the groups he was lecturing with was this New Age group, the Golden Way Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is where he met Joseph DeMambro. And so they soon, decide to collaborate. And in 1984, within 2 years, they found the Solar Temple. And this is when Jure was traveling widely through French-speaking Europe, Eastern Canada, and Martinique, and as an inspirational speaker, right? And he's really just speaking about this kind of esoteric homeopathic, healing. It's very interesting. But he's also kind of viewed as a sex symbol by a lot of the females who he was recruiting, which I find very interesting. And it seems like he was having sexual relations with many of the different women who were involved in the group. And it seems also that their majority of the members of the group, at least it seemed to be more of them were female, right? Very interesting to me. And but it also, I don't know, it kind of made sense because of the sexual rituals that they were performing and the sex magic, they were actually performing. But I don't know, because this whole notion of the doctrine that surrounds the child king, the child god king, the solar god king, that would inevitably be this great mission that DeMambro would announce, awaited the foundation prior to the real organized creation of the OTS. He also announced that this child king was to be born into the community, which of course just coincidentally happens to be his child, right? Yeah,
wow,
right. And so French author Marc Pivois, this is when DeMambro, at least this is according to French author, this is when DeMambro had the idea to use a young drug-addicted woman as the surrogate mother. All right. And in June 81, DeMambro, then 57 years old, began an affair with a 21-year-old Dominique Bellatone. He later claimed to receive a revelation from the masters that Bellatone would produce a cosmic child through theogamy, a ceremony in the order's crypt organized with special effects. I believe that was Tony Dutoit, who, by the way, I believe Dutoit was the one that broke from the order. And although he was providing the special effects and the holograms and all the different things that were really convincing a lot of the group, over the years, as the child, this solar god king, which was really a female named Emmanuelle, which was DeMambro's daughter, she was supposed to be the one to fulfill the prophecy, right? And she inevitably, along with her brother, as they come of age, they balk at all of this. They completely reject it and tend to, what seems to be, they are exposing it all to the group. And they first don't listen to the son. They first don't listen to the boy. But once the young girl, or the girl who's coming of age, I believe it's 16 at the time, when she decides to reject it all and try and convince the others that her brother was right, that Dutoit was staging these fake holographic, special effects during the ceremonies to convince them of the doctrine, and that none of it was true. And so then you have this mass exodus of the group where a lot of members begin to flood out and they're leaving the group. They lose faith in the organization. Joseph DeMambro and Jaurès, for that matter, are in bad health, it seems, by that time. And so it's starting to
fray at the seams, so to speak.
100%. Yes, it's very much so. And so I think that really, the most important part is kind of the internal group dynamics leading up to the tragedies, because the amount of time it would take for us to really kind of dissect the overall structure of the Knights Templars and let's say what they describe as a Templar Renaissance. Like I said, there are so many different organizing bodies, Luciferian groups. The Green Order are tied in with Julian Orrigas, which is, who was this individual tied directly to Gladio and Luc Jaurès, who Luc Jaurès took over his group before the foundation of the Solar Temple. And many of those group members actually went with him to join DeMambro to found the OTS after Orrigas died. But it's absolutely insane when you discover how vast the network of secret societies really is, how many different groups are just offshoots of another,
right? And schisms and fights, and
it's amazing. But the internal group dynamics leading up to the tragedies kind of really to me, it makes the most credible case for, I believe that the majority of the individuals who died were most likely murdered. I think that there was very much so, I believe that potentially there were individuals who were convinced of the doctrine and may have voluntarily committed suicide. But you could say the same thing in Jonestown to a certain extent, but because there are people shouting down on the death tape, right? Shouting down the woman who I forget her name now, but who's questioning Jim Jones and saying, don't we have some sort of solution where we can get out of this and not go through with this voluntary suicide? And so Um, but I think it's really the best credible argument that's been made. I really give to um, the Order of the Solar Temple, the Temple of Death, the book that I kind of would first of all encourage everyone to go read, because I kind of consider that to be like the ultimate, almost the Bible of what took place overall. With it actually includes a lot of the secret societies aspect to the lead up and everything. And I think it's very important because there are so few books covering the subject that have been um, you know translated to English, because so much of it that's been covered is largely in French. And so it's kind of interesting to get your hands on anything that makes a credible argument and is questioning the official narrative. It's a little more difficult to find, but it's still out there. And so I immediately was flooded with thoughts of Jonestown when I read through chapter 7 of that book. And due to the uncanny similarities between the overexposure of the People's Temple in parallel with that of the OTS, along with the negative shift in the public's perception of the groups, leading up to the, of course, doomsday cult's imminent apocalyptic catastrophe, right? Because they're always kind of explained away and as just this fringe organization that holds extravagant beliefs, and they were convinced by some charismatic leader who just fits the bill of a David Koresh. That's how they always like to frame it, and let alone look into Waco and discover the truth behind what happened there, right? But it was very convenient at the time. And Luc Jouret himself, even he received many different comparisons to David Koresh. I found that interesting. But anyway,
it may have just been a huge cleanup operation, and they got rid of it. It got too sketchy and was falling apart. And where's the money? Like, where's the money? There's an issue of where's the money, and how did some of these people get in the position? Really dark. And how did they organize it? And there was something I remember in one of the documentaries. It was that somebody came up like a couple, 2 or 3 days later and had some kind of statement. So who made that statement? So people are still around who didn't end up dead. And then there's another series of deaths, 15 months later. It's incredible.
It is incredible.
All ritualized deaths, ritualized body placements. So something strange is going on. Something really odd that they probably, somebody was happy that they focused on Jouret and Demambro and got away with the money. Like, who knows? I mean, that's incredible. They say, this article right here, Princess Grace, for people who aren't seeing this live, it's from 1997. It says, Princess Grace, this is Grace Kelly, the famous Grace Kelly of Monaco, belonged to the Order of the Solar Temple, whose suicide rituals claimed 74 lives since 1994. The Sunday Times has reported, quoting producers of a documentary on the cult, David Carr Brown and David Cohen, say Princess Grace was initiated into the order only a few months before her death in a car accident on September 1982. The Channel 4 documentary, which will be broadcast next Monday, says the princess gave nearly $10 million to the sect before her death. That's huge.
That is so insane. And that was, again, like I said, people were signing over their estates to Demambro. Absurd how much that group had actually accumulated in assets over time. And like you said, where did all those assets go? And it's all been seemingly covered up. And especially when you even go as far as to realize that these poor family members of some of the victims, they have been questioning this outwardly, publicly. They even performed their own personal investigations to attempt to expose how this was not voluntary at all, especially considering their family members who were involved allegedly in the deaths in Quebec. But even the Canadian coroner's report stated that given the scale of the issues facing the group leaders, that was why they would transit to Sirius, right? So they're as much as admitting the fact that it was really the public exposure of the money laundering and the BCCI connections to the money laundering and really the gun running, which I think when Luc Jouret and those other members were caught running guns just before the first deaths took place, I think that was really they tripped on their own shoelaces, and when you're a part of something like that, I think you better remain useful is the ultimate right concern to the overall health of the organization and its long-term existence. But so just to at least like before we get out of here, I should at least mention, because I have so many notes that I should have already known. It would be impossible for us to discuss. But so really 2 fires broke out in Switzerland on October 4th and 5th in 94. And one at around 11:55 in Le Rocher farm in Chéry, and another in 3 chalets at Le Fond-du-Ban in Salvan. And when the fire department arrived, they found 23 people dead in Chéry and 25 in Salvan. The victims were, in most cases, dressed in a white, black, or gold ritual cloak, depending on the degree of initiation reached. And in Switzerland, many of the victims were found in a secret underground chapel lined with mirrors. And this is where the pentagrams were on the floor surrounding they had this just sitting in the middle of the room. It was so strange the way they had it all set up. And like you had shown, like there are actual videos of these rituals that took place, but they were very much only recruiting a specific sect of society. That is very clear. So, but in this first area in Switzerland, Jouret was among the dead in Salvan, allegedly. And many bodies were burned beyond recognition. That's another thing. You have all of these advanced pyrotechnic incendiary devices that had been set up, and I think that hadn't gone off. And so I think the ultimate goal was to cover this all up, to burn it all to the ground. And they had even kept documents that the group had intended to destroy. But inevitably, the incendiary devices didn't trigger. And so therefore, there was evidence that wasn't supposed to remain on the scene. And I think that, again, of course, it didn't go as planned. And so we get a little peek into what potentially really occurred. And so Jouret and DeMambro's bodies had to be identified via dental records. So to me, that raises some sort of skepticism. But DeMambro's wife and child were also among the dead. And at the time of the investigation, due to the death of the 2 leaders in Salvan, Michel Tabachnik was the only defendant in the case. The examining magistrate considered that Tabachnik, through his writings and his conferences, could have incited followers to commit suicide. He was therefore charged with participation in a criminal conspiracy to commit a crime. He didn't spend much time, though. It seems like he was just kind of given this light sentencing. So someone would be, at least you could point to, as being held accountable for this tragedy. But so, of course, he was therefore charged. And then this Claude Guérin, a member of the group and a pharmacist, this I found very strange as well, because he was indicted for criminal conspiracy in February of 97. He was suspected of supplying the drugs used in the killings to the group. And this case against him was dismissed in July of that same year. And in the run-up to the criminal court trial against Michel Tabachnik, the families of the victims filed a civil action. Having consulted the experts' files, the civil party identified a number of inconsistencies in the investigation, such as the fact that the organic environment around the bodies of the immolated victims was completely intact and showed no trace of fire. The civil party then asked for counter expertise and questioned the theory of collective suicide. So you're already seeing, like, just below the surface of the official narrative, you're discovering that clearly it's not as it's being portrayed.
There's a lot more. There's a lot more issues. There were complaints
Very
from the
much.
families that the gun that they said the police, the officials said
Right.
used was a one-shot pistol.
Yes.
So you would have had to have shot somebody, reloaded, shot, reloaded, reshot like 40 or 50 times, which would have
Absurd.
taken half an hour, and nobody fought at that point or ran for it or did anything.
Exactly.
So it's
And
like, it's silly. And that's just like some of the surface facts. There's a lot more problems.
Exactly. Because to that point, the bullet wounds on the bodies, they didn't even correspond with any of the weapons found at the farm and Cherie. And this suggests that someone performed executions and then fled the scene.
Yes.
Which,
and there wasn't one shot, one body, 3 bullets, 5 bullets.
Exactly.
One victim had 9 bullets. So is that coming from a one shot? They should have, the investigators would have immediately said, hey, there's a problem, should have said there's a huge red flag, but they didn't, which is somewhat telling. And these guys have been around, and I've followed, and fortunately researched a bunch of cults, and sometimes they infiltrate the law enforcement, or they influence, or some of the people are involved, like the 2 policemen in Canada, right? So they're trying to find, if you're a very cunning cult leader, you find people to, and just like Jim Jones was heavily involved in San Francisco politics. Yes. Some of these guys might have done that. So there's a lot more to this story.
And the authorities in France said as much. There were individuals who came out attempting to blow the whistle, saying that they were completely derailed and railroaded in the course of the investigation and by higher ups. And it's once again, it's just another example that we can point to. Of course, the RCMP even confirmed the investigation into money laundering by the Solar Temple. And there were multiple reports, like we've said, that the cult was used as a front to provide cover for arms smuggling as well. So I think that anytime you research any of these organizations that tend to overlap, like Cabazon Indian Reservation and Whack and Hunt, and in Danny Castellero's case, it's very similar to the same things happening in Belgian Gladio, right? And to me, it fits the playbook. It's pattern recognition that I kind of tend to lean toward, but I always try and corroborate things and be honest when I'm speculating, right? But when you can point to the son and brother of 2 of the victims of these killings who conducted their own parallel private investigations, Alain Varney is one of them, I believe, and I think his dad was even like a famous marathon runner or something of that nature. But since 1995, they were questioning the collective suicides of the members of the OTS. And it still hasn't been fully explained. But they, at the very least, do a better job than the authorities did. And as far as considering the official narrative, and he complained about the lack of cooperation from the Justice Department and justice system, which completely refused to investigate the possibility of murder. They were only willing to probe the mass suicide and who was responsible for convincing them to do so. And I get this different experts as well. Like there's a professor that commissioned, he was commissioned by Verret, I believe, because pretty much what they wanted was an expert to investigate this phosphorus that was found at the scene. And his name's Gilbert Lavoie. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it indicated that the use of a flamethrower potentially occurred, which would imply that there had been no suicide but a staged event, according to this family. And so an article was then published in a French newspaper, Libération, August 14th, 2003, by Jackie Durand, and then was translated into English subsequently. And it's astounding because it really does lend credibility to this account. No one knows that the remains of these bodies right, at the request of, that were exhumed on July 4th, right, at this time, and were all at the request of the family to carry out new private expertise. And the relatives of Edith and Patrick Vornay are the ones who actually died, have always ruled out the idea of collective suicide, in which the mother and son, followers of the OTS, died in 1995. And they have been conducting what is akin to a private investigation for 8 years. So this is when the potential, what they claim is that they even reconstruct the actual event, right? In this Grenoble investigation by this judge, Luc Fontaine. And this took place on the night of December 15th to 16th in 1995. And so it happened in this valley nestled in the Vercors Massif. And so 14 of the victims, including Edith and Patrick Vornay, the official narrative, they had taken a cocktail of sedatives before being deliberately shot several times by André Friedli, a Swiss architect, and Jean-Luc Lardenchet, a French policeman. And so the Swiss architect, by the way, involved with Hydro-Quebec. And so the two men then doused the bodies with gasoline, covered them with branches before setting them on fire, and then they committed suicide with a bullet in the mouth before falling into the blaze, right? And so this thesis never, of course, convinced the family, Alan Vornay or his father, who, yes, wasn't a marathon runner. He was a former Olympic ski champion. And so what they said is, we remain convinced, my father and I, that it is not with a few damp branches that these 16 bodies were charred to this extent. They said in an interview with Paris Match on April 19th, 2001, shortly before the first criminal trial of the Order of the Solar Temple in 2001, this family had already mandated this professor to carry out the analyses. They had shown that the soil taken from the site of the pyre in the Vercors contained high doses of phosphorus, 1 kilo per cubic meter of soil. This product can only be used by the military and with military or paramilitary weapons. The presence of this phosphorus seems to prove that external elements participated in this execution. Alain Varney told Paris Match, but the criminal court of Grenoble did not accept this hypothesis involving the use of a phosphorus flamethrower, according to the professor. But of course, when you have all these various absurd oddities that we're pointing to, revealing, and the Vernay family themselves revealed all these different things, but it was all covered up. It got no attention whatsoever, and so you have to rely on these sort of, they're never mainstream official accounts. They're never actual, right? They're alternative journalists, alternative publications that are actually willing to approach these subjects, investigate these subjects honestly, put their credibility at risk, but also depart from the status quo, which is to always support the establishment narrative, no matter what the case is, right? And I think that, we should be very aware at this point that in no way are they going to be timid as far as spilling blood of any sort of individual involved in covering up some of these organized networks that could come back and really cast a light on the operational procedures of the intelligence apparatus, that they know no international boundaries, right? They have no borders that they actually, respect at any level. And this is another example of that, right? The Order of the Solar Temple perfectly fits this network of covert, clandestine, domestic intelligence of many kinds, right? Because it very often, you see these groups are always embedded with money laundering, gun smuggling, right? Arms smuggling. And that's exactly what we find here. And so I think that it's probably a large aspect of this can be, typically traced back to some sort of intelligence operation, because that's why you would have something like this pharmacist who was indicted on February 11th in 97 for a criminal association to the homeopathic specialist and friend of late Luc Jouret. He is the one who had the case dismissed on July 13th. But he's also the pharmacist who was suspected of having provided the drugs, a neuroleptic Rohypnol and a cardiotonic digoxin ingested by the victims of the Vercors before their deaths. And so, to me, that falls in line with Jonestown, right? Like, these people are not in the right mind, and clearly they were drugged beforehand, right? And so, whether that was to make it easier to transition into a mass suicide, or whether it was to make it easier to potentially commit a mass murder, right? Because it would be a lot more difficult to kill a lot of people if they were fighting back and resisting.
One of the mysteries is that nobody contacted their family and said, guys, I'm not going to be around much longer, or I got 2 weeks to live, or Luc Jouret said we're all going to have to commit suicide, or something. Like, that's a mystery in itself, that
Absolutely.
Nobody had that sense of self-preservation to run for it, right? So that, I think, is very telling. Like, that's
100%.
another mystery. Like, why didn't one person escape? Hey, they tried to kill me. I wasn't in that deep. I'm out of here, later.
Exactly.
Like, so these are very kind of sophisticated events. And one thing, I guess the Heaven's Gate is like it, but Jonestown,
Right.
we know, had like run-throughs and things like that.
Oh, definitely.
Suicide.
Yeah, the White Knights, right? They would consistently. It was very strange, but Terry Huguenin was at least one victim who survived the OTS, and that was the one who they attempted to even lure, who was supposed to be the 54th victim.
Okay.
And they attempted to lure him back to the property, and when he got there, they smelled gas, significant amount of gas, and he fled the area, and basically he was lured there just based on them owing him money and him being willing. Yes. And I found his story very sad, because I found him to be a true believer, I think. And once he discovered that he had really been, that DeMembro was a con artist, and that that Dutoit was staging these holographic, ceremonies and things with the descended masters, and he was heartbroken. It was like, he even said in an interview, I saw him say that he really considered killing himself. He considered committing suicide because of how fiercely he believed in the doctrine and how much it shook him to his core, when he found out and discovered that he had been so seduced and so convinced that this was a reality. And I did feel very bad for him, because it seems like he was supposed to actually be killed as well. And he was very worried about speaking out publicly and was a very timid person. And yes, I was. So there were true believers in this organization. So I can't for a moment begin to claim that not all of them, right? Like, it's very possible that many of them did voluntarily, right? At least
suicide,
at least take the poison or take the drugs and allow it to take place. And I would not be shocked, but I will say that the evidence of that, one, this pharmacist who of course gets off when he's providing, he got like 500,000 French, what was it? What was the currency at that? I can't remember.
Francs,
yeah, francs. Yeah, I believe that he got like 500,000 francs, like right around that time. And so it seemed like he delivered the amount of drugs necessary for this mass death. And then he was paid off. And subsequently, they let him off as far as any sort of legal accountability. But and then, it's you can't have like individuals found dead among the bodies, right, that were agents of the intelligence service, and like this Judge Pillar had burned evidence and argued that Inspector Jean-Pierre Lardenchet was pretty much just out of his element. And it's what they typically do to cover up any of these sort of operations, and that's exactly what took place. That's why people still believe that no children were abused in the Franklin scandal, right? It's like the official narrative is, I guess Larry King was just, guilty of running some sort of scandal through his right.
They prosecuted the children
No,
in the
that's what I'm
Franklin
saying.
scandal. I know, what a joke. It's like,
Absolutely.
that's unbelievable. Like, they didn't go after the perps. Well, the Epstein situation is basically the same. The kids got the money, but nobody found out who the Johns were. They didn't go after and have mass arrests, because it probably would have upended American society. It was that bad.
100%, man. And
I gotta run.
Okay,
Austin, where's the best place for people? You did 2 hours on this alone, so where's the best place for people to listen to this, listen to your podcast, and then follow up with you if they have any other
awesome
questions?
All right, William, I'm telling you, I think that the problem is I could have done like 6 parts to this probably, and we could really dive into the details and cover a lot of it more. But thank you so much for having me on, William, again. And all of you, I hope, will go subscribe to my YouTube at the Underclass Podcast. Also, support me on Patreon at the Underclass Podcast, or on Buzzsprout as well. And you can find my podcast basically anywhere at the Underclass Podcast, and follow me at Underclass Pod on Twitter, at the Underclass Podcast on Instagram.
And what other shows you've done? You just did a show with Gallison and
Monica
Perez, right?
We have a weekly show as well that we sort of have under the umbrella of both of our podcasts. No Way Jose for Jose Gallison, and the Underclass for myself, and we both upload and publish a series we call Already Dead, which is just our weekly show on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we just do a live stream for 45 minutes. We kind of just, have a casual conversation about some sort of timely events or something we've been spiraling on, investigating ourselves. And then the other 45 minutes to an hour, we kind of engage with the live chat, and we open up, for call-ins or even patrons we allow to come and join us on the live stream. So, if anybody enjoys Already Dead, please support me. I would appreciate that. But yeah, we did just have Monica Perez on, and she's brilliant. She's a lot of fun to talk to, and I've always enjoyed her. And we've had many different people. We had BX on, Radix, Radix Verum,
all them, yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Even Nick Bryant, which was a blessing. Is so surreal to have a discussion with Nick, just because of how much he's impacted me personally, and kind of removed the veil for me, because I was dragged into this kicking and screaming when it comes to researching the occult, and especially researching any sort of child abuse networks. And they're just very hard to stomach. But once you're aware of them, it almost becomes a duty to really kind of try and honestly tackle the true subject and investigate honestly, just for the victims alone, so. But yeah, sorry, I'm very long-winded, and thank you very much again for having me on, William. I'm a huge fan.
Thanks,
and
I
hope
appreciate your time. What other shows have you done? Have you researched? You've done the the Psychopath Machine with Smith. I know that.
Machine. I kind of covered The Ultimate Evil with The Process and things of that nature, which there's just so many insane connections there. I thought I had covered Manson, but apparently I had not, right? And there were many more connections and threads to pull on there. But yes, I also have done work with, let's say, I went on Tinfoil Hat with Sam Tripoli, and we discussed Ruby Ridge, which was a huge red pill moment for me, and removed the veil as well for what your government's capable of, and then I also got the chance to have a conversation with Clint Russell on Liberty Lockdown, who he's just doing great work at this point, and I've been a fan for a long time as well, and we discussed the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, which, yes, there's a lot more. There's a lot more there. And so
you talked to Ken Silva,
son
of Sam, Charlie Robinson. I've done shows with Robinson.
Charlie's great.
Brian, Brad Binkley, good stuff. So you've got some great kidnapping of Patty Hearst. I've done some.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. James Holmes as well. I think that's one I'm very proud of. My Pizzagate episode is one of the episodes I'm most proud of. It was apparently I violated some sort of terms of service with YouTube on that one, because
you're not supposed to talk about that anymore. It didn't happen. It's all a fraud.
Right.
Austin, there's no evidence anywhere, right? You almost like say that and have the huge black and white hypno circle behind your head.
Exactly.
It's not. They busted the guy who tried to debunk it. He had like some kind of reams of child porn or something like that.
My gosh.
Yeah, did you ever hear that story?
Yes.
So guys online saying, oh yeah, you guys are all, it's like a version of satanic panic. It's like the conspiracy theory panic or whatever.
That is incredible.
Is their thing. And then he gets busted with like anybody who denies that, they should go and check their hard drive.
They really should.
Immediately.
Yes.
Pizzagate's real. I actually reposted my old Pizzagate stuff. It's even worse because there's like connections to Hunter Biden, and there's connections to some of these guys who are involved in the shot rollout. Like it gets really sick and creepy. Like it
really does.
People didn't know that back then. They didn't know back then what they know now.
Exactly.
So it's even worse than people thought. Yeah.
Agreed. And I start that episode, I believe, with the Laura Silsby story of the Haiti connection and the Clinton cover up there, and that was the timestamp they even referenced in the YouTube violation, was the story of Laura Silsby, which it's proven at this point. She came back and changed her name and disappeared, right? Yeah, she was
fully changed her name. They had to track her down or something like that.
Extraordinary.
It's incredible. I mean, the corruption that we're seeing, they're not even talking about the sex trafficking and child trafficking that's going on. Like, this is so sick. The country's like a freaking, it's almost like Roman paganism or something. It's so really dark at the stuff that's going on. It's unacceptable. Yeah. But that's part of it was Pizzagate. That was like, and there were all those codes. Like, I went through Alephantis's stuff on Instagram. And it was like, super disturbing, but almost like you're talking in mob tongue, where they had different terms for weird stuff. Same with the Podesta's emails, which mentioned the Lima of all things. But like, we got black and white handkerchiefs on walnut sauce bottle. Well, what the hell are you guys talking about?
It is so insane. Yeah, and you even have like in the Podesta emails, there was even all these references to like Farmer L, Tamara Lozado, and
that's right. The three girls will be in the hot tub tonight. They're 8, 10, and 12. Like, whoa. Like, that's like almost like advertising for the pedophiles or something. Like,
it really is, man.
Sick. It's
sickening.
Sick. Anyway, people check that out. When you're on X Twitter, so if people need to follow up with you or want to talk to you more, they can find you there.
Definitely.
What's your handle?
At Underclass Pod, but also you can follow me at Theater Thug AWP, which is just my personal, I've had for years and years and years. But
is that a website, AWP?
No, it's my initials, Austin Wade Picard. Yeah.
So Theater Thug at AWP or
no. On Twitter, it's
sorry.
Theater Thug AWP is my handle.
I misunderstood that.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
But about an hour and a half. Like, that's why I don't go over 90 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Right. So, I don't know. I did the same thing with Gallison. He's like, "Do you want to take questions?" Is like a lot. When I was talking to him, I was like, I think I was just kind of spaced out. I was already kind of drifting off. Anyway,
that's great.
Anyway, Austin Picard. The podcast is The Underclass. We discussed the Solar Temple. There's a lot more to this story. It's an incredible story, and should be covered in greater detail in people who study cults. But I think the real barrier is really the language thing. I think it's just because it's covered heavily in the French world, but not in the English. So thank you so much for your time.
Of course. Thank you, William.
All right, stay there.